Alright, so today's lesson is going to be on squares and square roots. You might already remember from our earlier discussion of powers what a square is, but just so you recall that, a square is when you take a number times itself, like 3 times 3 would be 9. Well, since you have two 3's multiplied by each other, that's also known as 3 squared, which is going to give us 9. Any number like 9, which can be derived from two numbers multiplied together, we call that a perfect square. Some other examples of perfect squares would be 16, because if I take 4 times 4, I get 16. Also, we could have 25, we could have 36. Those are all perfect squares. Any number that can be broken down into two identical numbers times each other, is considered a perfect square. Now, a square root is what we're going to find whenever we take a number. We want to find what two numbers multiply to give us that number. So how we write a square root symbol is with this symbol called the radical sign. So if I have radical sign 16, that means I want the square root of 16, which is going to be equal to 4. So if we want to write that, we can say that the square root of y, let's see, if we were trying to find the square root of y, we could say y is defined as x squared. That would mean the square root of y is equal to x. It's equal to one of these x's, just like 16 is equal to one of these 4's when we take the square root of it. So let's look if we had the square root of 36. Well, we know that if we take 6 times itself, that gives us 36, so the square root of 36 is 6. What if we had negative square roots of 81? Well, in this case, the negative sign's on the outside, so we're going to say negative, and then the square root of 81 is going to be 9. So my answer to that is going to be negative 9. We could also have something like this, where it's plus or minus the square root of 9. Notice if I take 3 times 3, that gives me 9, of course, but also if I take negative 3 times negative 3, that's also going to give me 9. So either of these two answers, 3 or negative 3, will work for this. So we're going to say plus or minus 3. Now let's take a look at if we had a variable. If we had the square root of x squared, well, the number that gives me x squared is going to be x. The thing is, if we're looking for the positive, we only want positive numbers here. So what we can do is we can put x in absolute values, and that's only going to allow us to have positive numbers for x, since as we saw here, x could be positive or negative, but since we don't have this plus or minus sign, we're only caring about the positive x. Right, so sometimes you're not always going to have perfect squares where it works out to be nice integers multiplied by each other. Sometimes you might have something like the square root of 10. To find that, you have to find the square root key on your calculator. You're going to get an ugly number, but you can round that up to 3.2. Another number, for example, if you had the negative square root of 27, you plug that in your calculator, you're going to get something like negative 5.2. Now let's say we didn't have a calculator and we wanted to estimate something like the square root of 38. Well, one thing we can do is, well, we know that the square root of 36 is 6, which is lower than 38. The next perfect square is the square root of 49, which gives us 7. So that tells us that the square root of 38 is somewhere in between 6 and 7. Since 38 is closer to 36 than it is to 49, we can probably gather that on a number line, it's going to be much closer to the 6 than it is to the 7. So we can estimate that this is going to be somewhere between 6 and 7, maybe something like 6.2 as an estimate. Another example is, say we had maybe the negative square root of 175. We know that there's a perfect square. 169 gives me 13. The perfect square of 196 gives me 14. And 175 lies in between 13 and 14 here. Well, we should say negative 13 and negative 14. So on a number line, we'd have negative 14 down here, negative 13 here. It looks like negative 175 is a little bit closer to the 169, so my dot's going to be a little closer to the negative 13.